Hi, everyone. My name's Paul Newnham. I'm the Executive Director of the Sustainable Development Goal 2 Advocacy Hub, which is housing the Secretariat of the Hungry for Action campaign. And I'm super excited to be joined by also the new director of our campaign, Alice McDonald, who you're going to hear from towards the end of the session. And she started with us just a couple of weeks ago. And so super excited to have her with us. So as we get started, just a little bit of scene setting. In May 2022, as the impacts of the war in Ukraine were increasingly felt across the globe, advocates acknowledged that the world is facing multiple interconnected crises. And there is a need for a system-level response that both addresses the immediate humanitarian needs whilst seeking system change. So advocates across climate, nutrition, food security, food systems, and beyond gathered to raise awareness and demand action of the developing food crisis through the Hungry for Action campaign. In order to respond to the scale of this crisis, Hungry for Action is calling for both immediate humanitarian actions and long-term systems change to save lives now, build resilience, and secure the future. The World Bank spring meetings are on an important moment for the campaign. We want to see action to tackle the food crisis at the top of the agenda, and it must include unlocking the necessary financing. Ahead of the World Bank and IMF spring meetings from the 10th to the 16th of April, today's interactive discussion gathers a terrific lineup of speakers to discuss the magnitude of the global food crisis and the opportunity to mobilize the financing at scale to tackle the climate crisis and the food crisis urgently in order to put the world on track to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. We're going to hear today about what can be achieved at the country level to transform food systems and if the necessary financing is made available. So I'm going to introduce our speakers in alphabetical order, and my colleagues will add their bios to the chat. So in order to save some time, we've got very distinguished guests with quite extensive bios. So we're going to drop them in so you can look them up. But I'm just going to do a brief introduction. So we have Father Alex Muyebe, the director of the Jesuit Center for Theological Reflection in Zambia. Welcome. We have David McNair, one's executive director for global policy. Welcome. We have Francine Picard, the Shamba Center for Food and Climate's co-founder and director of partnerships. Welcome. We have Jean-Martin Beyer, UN World Food Program country director in Haiti. Welcome. And we have Sarah Simmons, the manager of the World Bank Agricultural Global Practice Trust Funds and Partnership. Welcome. And then we have Sophia Ahmed, the Food and Land Use Coalition's Ethiopia country manager. So a really distinguished group. We have only an hour to get through all of this material, and we're keen to have this conversation to be as interactive as possible. So I just want a couple of quick housekeeping points before we get started. Everyone has access to the chat. And so if you are chatting with everyone in the link, there's a little drop down of who you can chat to. Then you can introduce yourself there, where you're dialing in from. So, where you're logging in from now, and any questions and thoughts as we go for the speakers. We're going to hopefully have time for a brief Q&A if we can keep to time and I do my job properly. And we'll hopefully address a couple of those queries. So also, I just would love you to keep yourself on mute if you're not speaking so that we can be really sure that there's no sound issues for the speakers or interruptions. It's a Zoom meeting, which often we don't do. We do a webinar, but Zoom meetings, it means that mute button is in your control, but we may mute you if you forget. But we're going to try and continue that through. We are also recording, and we will share this so that if you're utilizing or learning from this and you want to share it with other colleagues, you can also do that afterwards. So we're going to dive straight in. To set the scene, we have the UN World Food Program's country director in Haiti, Jean-Martin, and Father Alex from the director of the Jesuit Center for Theological Reflection in Zambia. And so it's great to have you both on. Jean-Martin, let me start with you. We've started with an unprecedented rise in acute food insecurity around the world, could you give us a bit of a sense of the scale of the humanitarian need globally and in Haiti particularly? Over to you.
Thanks, Paul. Good morning from Port-au-Prince. Pleasure to be here. And this is this is the right time to be raising the topic about how we fund a response to the growing food crisis around the world. Hunger and needs to respond to hunger are rising worldwide. And I'll give you some numbers to illustrate that, starting by here in Haiti and overall around the world. Here in Haiti, the number of people who are acutely food insecure has risen from 1.7 million in 2017 in the aftermath of Hurricane Matthew to almost 5 million, according to the last release we've had last week. So that's quite an increase in a very short time. That means that the World Food Program here has changed its program of work. In 2020, we were helping about 1 million people in this country. This year, we're attempting to reach 2.5 million because of the degradation in food security conditions. And our financial needs have risen in the past few years from 113 million to 331 million. Financial needs have also tripled. Worldwide, it's also the same story. We've had acute food insecurity. Before the pandemic, it was around 135 million people worldwide. That's increased today to 345 million. So these are in countries where WFP has operations. The number of beneficiaries WFP has been trying to reach all over the world. So that was just under 100 million before the pandemic. Right now, we're at 150. And our financial needs have risen from $13.7 billion in 2020 to 21 billion this year. So that's a 50% increase. So you get the message. Needs are rising. This is quite quickly in a very short period of time. So this is quite a challenge for us all. Now why is this happening? I mean, in the case of Haiti, there are very specific dynamics, but that happen to be mirrored in other contexts. Right here in Haiti, we're facing the impact of armed groups on all of society, but including Haiti's farmers, who are increasingly having trouble sending food to their markets. The country is citizens are facing lower incomes as a result of violence and displacement. We're also looking at high levels of inflation in Haiti, linked to global trends and also to these local trends and the impact of conflict. And we're also facing climate shocks. Right now, there's been a lack of rainfall over the past 10 years. That's also handicapped the country's ability to feed itself. So more funding is needed. More funding is needed now, because without more resources, we'll be facing quite a difficult situation in this country. It's hard to see how we get out of a tripling of acute food insecurity in just a few years unless we step up and do more. Now, it's interesting to reflect a little bit about where we are. I've been at the World Food Program for the past 22 years. When I was a young professional here, the financial needs for the World Food Program were in the billions, but in the low single digits. And I just told you that now we're looking at a need for this year of over $21 billion. So this has been a longer term trend where for food security needs have just been rising for decades. It's also more difficult for us to react. If you think just 15 years ago, we didn't have countries like Syria or Yemen, emergencies like Ukraine, all at the same time. So the burden on us is much higher than it used to be. And overall, the humanitarian system is much higher financial needs. If you look at the financial tracking service of OCHA, UN OCHA, the coordinating agency for humanitarian work, the annual humanitarian response plan, the appeal for 2020 was at $38 billion. And today, for this year, it's up to $54 billion. So you've got competing crises, as Paul mentioned, and competing demands for a limited amount of funding. So what does this all mean? And I'd like to end with a few remarks here. We need to ask ourselves, is the system broken? And there have been people saying that the system is broken, that we're not able to respond to the combination of all of these needs at the same time. I'd like to also remark on the danger of having forgotten crises. I mean, Haiti is a forgotten crisis. I don't know how many of you have heard about Haiti in the media recently. Probably not many, judging by the amount of media coverage there is. But there is a risk of ignoring and not investing because that turns into a situation that just goes from bad to worse. And certainly in Haiti, we've had the tripling of acute food insecurity in just a few years, and that's partially due to lack of investment and lack of interest by the country's partners. And there is a cost to inaction. So the cost to inaction is, of course, higher, more suffering in terms of the people who experience food insecurity on a daily basis. But there are also impacts in terms of the stability of the societies that experience hunger and repeated years of hunger at this level. So now is the time to think differently about these things. It's the time to think about how we can get more partners on board and how we could do better in terms of diversifying the resource base that's needed to fund projects in the short term and the long term to get us to food security. So Paul, back to you on that note.
Yeah, thanks, Jean-Martin. You've painted a really stark and human picture of this global food crisis and the importance for us to not forget different regions as well, because, you know, there is that tendency in the news to see certain things and think it's only there, but to actually look at the holistic picture around the world. So thank you so much. Thank you also to everyone who's joining and dropping your names and where you're dialing in from. Great to see such a global audience here from across the world. Father Alex, I'd like to bring you in. Like too many countries, Father Alex, Zambia is a highly debt distressed. JCTR monitors the cost of living in Zambia and its implications for vulnerable communities. Can you give us a snapshot of what's happening to food prices in the country, how Zambia's debt situation impacts the government's ability to act, and what you're calling on governments to do? Over to you.
Thank you, Paul. And thank you everyone for joining this webinar this afternoon. It's a great pleasure to share our experience in Zambia. Just like Paul has mentioned, that we are at the moment dealing with a huge debt crisis in Zambia. And that is impacting on the cost of living and also impacting on the availability of food and also even the quality of food itself. But let me begin by mentioning that one of the key works that JCTR does is to monitor the cost of living in Zambia on a monthly basis in order to assess the implications of the cost of living on the vulnerable communities. And the evidence that is generated is used to advocate for pro-poor policies aimed at addressing poverty and inequality in Zambia. And so we generate this evidence. We have 4 types of tools that we use to collect and analyze data. We use the basic needs and nutrition basket, which collects data from both urban and rural communities, and also the rural basic needs and nutrition basket, which collects data from the rural communities only. And then we have the satellite home survey, which collects data from the low-income households. And also we have mini studies, which collect data from a wide range of stakeholders, government actors, and also community members. So we have observed that the food prices in Zambia have been on the rise since the beginning of 2022 due to the impact of the pandemic and also the climate change and the onset of the Ukraine-Russian conflict. But specifically speaking to 2023, we've seen that since January, there is a new wave now of upsurge in food prices due to the stagnation in the Zambia's debt restructuring negotiations under the G20 Common Framework. So allow me just to mention that since this crisis at the moment, that the debt situation is not being resolved as we expected that to be concluded in December 2022. We've seen that now that has impacted on the local currency, the kwacha, and so now we see that the basic JCTR basic needs and nutrition basket has now surpassed the $422 mark in the year 2023. This is considerably higher than the average monthly income in Zambia, which stands at $197, according to the study that was conducted by the official statistical institute in Zambia, the Zambia Statistics Agency, in their labor force survey of 2021. So according to the government, the delay in concluding the debt restructuring negotiations has put pressure on the local currency, which has weakened against major currencies. Now, from the cost of living perspective, a weaker currency implies greater import costs for an import-dependent country like Zambia, with the brunt of this burden being passed on the consumers in the form of higher prices on food, fuel, and other essential commodities. Unfortunately, these price increments are not accompanied by increments in nominal income or salaries. This means that the household's real income is reduced, and so is the household capacity to purchase the same quantity and quality of food and other basic necessities that it could previously afford. So just recently this week, JCTR released new reports, two reports, one on the recent satellite home survey and the other on the JCTR mean study on the impact of the cost of living on the poor households in Lusaka. Both studies have revealed that the rising cost of living is causing households to cut down on the number of meals per day, as well as compromise on the nutrition content of these meals. And the net result is that the rising costs of living has potential to drive low-income households into abject poverty. So just to conclude, what JCTR now is asking government is to address any impediments to concluding the debt restructuring process in order to arrest the escalating cost of living and also the cost of food. And debt restructuring is critical in Zambia in stabilizing the economic fundamentals such like the exchange rate and also the inflation and all other fundamentals, which are crucial for economic growth and poverty alleviation. Thank you.
Thank you, Father Alex. We can really see the impact here. It's a very concrete example of the debt crisis and the consequences in Zambia that are linked to this global food crisis. So thank you so much, Father Alex. I would like to now bring in David McNair's, who is ONE's Executive Director for Global Policy. David, you've been at the center of conversations about the reform of international financial institutions to unlock financing at scale to address the poly crisis, the pandemic, cost of living. We've just heard from Jean-Martin and Father Alex about the scale of humanitarian need. How do we connect these two conversations? How can IFI reform help the international community respond more swiftly to this current food crisis and also the future crises, but also free up the funds at scale to invest in food system transformation and maybe help us break this cycle of crisis upon crisis? Over to you.
Thanks, Paul, and thanks for having me. I think Jean-Martin and Father Alex have kind of described the humanitarian situation better than I ever could. And you know, the way that you opened this, Paul, was to say, you know, this is simply not just a one-off event, but it requires both a humanitarian response and systems change. So I've been thinking a little bit about the financing behind that. And to secure the financing that we need, I think we need to deploy the humanitarian arguments, but there are also other arguments that get to the real power centers that I think we need to consider deploying. And those are both focused on stability, but also on the geopolitical case for action. On stability, we all saw the international food prices shoot up in response to Putin's invasion of Ukraine. They have now subsided, but they're still at a level which is commensurate with the 2008-2010 food crisis, which we all know precipitated the Arab Spring. So there's a kind of stability and security argument around this. There's also a geopolitical argument, which is that leaders in the global south, you know, rightly highlighted at COP, you know, the failure of rich countries to deliver the 100 billion on climate finance. But I think it goes much deeper than that, because I think there's a feeling that, you know, vulnerable countries are suffering from crises created elsewhere, and they're also suffering from rich countries' responses to those crises. So the global financial crisis started in the US housing market, COVID started in China, Russia's invasion of Ukraine is obviously a European thing. But then if you look at the responses to those, the highly inequitable response to COVID, the response to the global financial crisis, which created all kinds of problems in the financial system, and now the response to inflation in rich countries, which, as Father Alex said, the increase in interest rates at the Federal Reserve to calm inflation in the US is both devaluing other currencies, but also increasing the cost of debt and, in some senses, exacerbating this debt crisis. So I think there's a case to be made that, in a geopolitical sense, a lot of vulnerable countries are looking to the West and saying, like, you're not, our friends on this, these are problems created outside of our countries and the responses to them are not there. And actually, you're not providing much support. And I think that's part of the reason why some of these discussions are kind of veering towards China and Russia and all the rest. But I think the response to these crises lies in building economic resilience. We already heard about the fact that, at the household level, the poorest spend about 50% of their income on food. So if you look at the price of staples increasing dramatically, that means there's going to be less food or less essential goods available. And at the country level, the same applies. So if you look at, the scale of the debt crisis, I think Zambia is an acute case, and Father Alex kind of described that really well. If you look at the global level, 1.5 billion people, so 1 in 5 people on the planet, live in countries that are at risk of debt distress. And because of much of that debt is denominated in US dollars, the increase at the Federal Reserve are increasing those costs, and the strengthening of the US dollar is reducing countries' spending power. And that means that countries have to make really impossible choices about, do they continue to service their debt, or do they invest in agriculture, in education, and health? And African countries now spend about 9.9% of their budget on debt service, about 6% on health. So this fiscal space for responding to these crises is just being squeezed. And that's before you get to the exogenous shocks that are created by climate change. Kenya saw a plague of locusts, which devastated its economy, which employs 40% of the population. Pakistan saw floods, which created 15 billion in damages. So we need to think about the financing that will create a step change. And I kind of thought through, 5 issues where the Hungary for Action Coalition could take on these issues. The first is, of course, fight for more humanitarian aid, but don't just use the humanitarian argument. Use the geopolitical argument and the security argument, because that will get to the centers of power that actually control the purse strings. Second is this whole debate on global public goods. And I see you taking your mute off, so I'll finish very, very soon, Paul. There is a renewed debate, at the World Bank and at the IMF about investing in global public goods. That is increasingly a euphemism for climate change. And I think food security should be in there as well, because of all the arguments we know so well. So I think, making the case that, food security is a global public good and should be invested in. Third is these financing instruments called SDRs, special drawing rights. A lot of us have campaigned for, major investments of these. There are about 60 billion that have been committed from rich countries, and very few of those have been drawn down. So I think working with countries to, access those funds through this trust called the Resilience and Sustainability Trust, but also through an instrument at the African Development Bank could be really important. We need to tackle the debt crisis, and I'm running out of time, so I'll not talk about that in a huge amount of detail. The final piece, which is coming up in 2 weeks' time, is around the spring meetings, the reform of multilateral development banks. And there's increasing pressure with a new president at the World Bank to say, we need to really scale up financing, maybe even triple the financing that the World Bank provides through, yes, more capital from shareholders, but also better sweating the balance sheet that the World Bank has. So I think to make the food security arguments, the geopolitical, the stability arguments for why this financing is needed, and getting to the corridors of power with an argument that they will respond to, will be really important to respond to some of these threats that we all see and are concerned about and are facing so many millions of people. Thanks, Paul.
Yeah, thanks, David. It's really, really helpful to have that outlook. Economic resilience is obviously key here, and we need to think about how we ensure that across the globe. We have just dropped a thought starter paper that David's written. I don't want you to all read it now, but it's for reading after this webinar. But that goes into some of David's points there as well, and could be helpful for you just in digesting some of this conversation. We will have some time, hopefully, for some questions, but if we don't get to them in this, we will answer them in some way as we send this out. So please feel free, if you do have questions, to put them in, continue introducing yourself. But we're going to continue on to help us further tease out the food system case for MDB reform and unlocking finance at scale. I'm going to bring in our other speakers to discuss the opportunities for food system transformation. So I'm going to ask Francine to join me first and share your insights. Francine, can you, I know you've had a few connection issues, so hopefully we're going to be all good, but can you tell us about your new report, Achieving Sustainable Food Systems in a Global Crisis, and how can it inform advocacy around the crisis and IFI reform? Over to you, Francine.
Thank you very much, Paul. I hope you are listening properly to me now.
We can hear you well.
Actually, I do have a PowerPoint, so I don't know if there may be a possibility. Wonderful, great. So actually, wonderful. So the whole report is a report that has been drafted by the International Institute for Sustainable Development, IFPRI, and Chamber Center, where we actually, Karen Smoller and myself, have been co-author. So the idea of the report is actually how we can achieve SDG 2, looking at, and I think that's what we can transform food system in 3 countries, Ethiopia, Malawi, and Nigeria. Next slide, please. So the goal of the report is really to use, if you can go to the next slide. So I can't see the slide moving, but I will continue the presentation.
We're on the goal
so
now. It says the goal.
The idea is really to take the evidence from one of the reports that we drafted. One target of 2.2. So what does it mean? So it means like we were looking at what kind of intervention country and donors need to target in order to first end hunger, make diets healthier and affordable, improve productivity and income for small-scale farmers, and mitigate climate change. So really it's about the food system transformation. And it's quite an ambitious project because we are targeting multiple outcomes. So we deep dive these studies into these 3 countries, Ethiopia, Malawi, and Nigeria. So what we did find, if we can go to next slide. So we found that actually it is possible to achieve SDG 2 and transform the food system in this country if we add, it's really an addition of $10 billion per year from now to 2030. And this, in that figure that you can see there, you have a share per country, but you have the share per donors and also the share by domestic resources. And this is the work that we have been doing, looking at what might be so those that global idea came also with specific intervention where we think that to achieve the SDG, we need to actually spend the money on specific intervention. If you can go to the next slide. So the slide can show you actually a series of intervention that we think that could provide those multiple outcomes. So it goes from increasing sustainable crops and livestock productivity for small-scale farmers. It also ensures that we need also to provide more investment in nutrition education, as well on the farm investment, as well as along the value chain. We have also a target on reducing food loss and waste. But as you can see, those targets also is also for country to also ensure what kind of the trade-off that they need also to unpack and decide. Because when we are looking at providing, reducing climate change, we need also to ensure that if you are looking this target on getting people more, providing them healthier diets, we know that meat consumption will be adding more value than something else. So it's also the kind of trade-off that country need also to undertake. So when we define those target intervention, I will go to the next slide. So just to ensure that we know exactly the number, we have the target number of 10 billion per year for these 3 countries. We know exactly what kind of intervention they need to tackle, but what those 10 billion are able to achieve, firstly, it can end hunger in all 3 countries by decreasing under 3%. It can also provide healthier diet for 238 million people. It could also ensure that 20 million farmers are out of poverty and in the same time reduce gas emission. So as you can see, it's quite ambitious because it's not targeting only one aspect of the problem. It's actually providing a series of outcomes that could touch on the poverty, healthy diet, and climate change mitigation and adaptation. So one of the other opportunity that this study provides us, I will go to the next slide, is also to show us that while we are also asking for country donors and country to make some effort, we also found that there is a financial gap, and that you can see the figure per country. It shows you that there is a stagnation on investment in agriculture, while the emergency food assistance is growing. So the share that you can see in the figure that I'm showing you is the additionality that we want if we want to target this SDG altogether, and the current spending. So the Malawi is a smaller country compared to Nigeria or Ethiopia. So you can see actually that the need to be Ethiopia due to the crisis that is happening in the bonds. And we can also see that in Nigeria also manage its own agriculture, but this last time they needed more assistance. And that's why you can see also that the food emergency request has been also growing. We'll be more actually telling you this slide that provide you this financing gap. It shows you the next slide, please.
And
it shows
Francine,
you
you're breaking quite a bit, just so you know.
how donors the agriculture
Francine, we're losing you. We're losing you, and unfortunately we're at time as well. Francine, we will share the slides, but it's absolutely, I think we were able to pick up the guts of this report. It's really useful to have these costed plans, and we'll look forward to this additional analysis that's going to be launched later this year. Sorry for the connection challenge there, Francine, but hopefully you'll be able to come back in a minute. We can't hear you, Francine. Okay. I'm gonna move on just due to time. So Sophia, I'm gonna come to you. So Sophia is from the Food and Land Use Coalition and has worked
So
with many country
in
governments.
that one, you can see the investment in the long term has been really significant.
Sorry, Francine, we can't hear you. I'm just sorry. Sophia. So Sophia from the Food and Land Use Coalition has worked with country governments to identify actions that could transform food systems. From your work in Ethiopia, could you give us a sense of what is possible if countries and communities have access to adequate financing?
Yeah, thank you, Paul, for the introduction. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending when you are. I'm happy to be part of this conversation. Going back to your question, Paul, our work in Ethiopia and what is possible if adequate finance is available. Yeah, many talks. Let me try to address. It's very clear the Ethiopian government have unwavering commitment in terms of implementing policy actions and strategies in place in terms of addressing food security, climate change, land degradation, nutrition. We are even in the front line in terms of producing our food system pathways for 2021 UN Food System Summit. So we are okay in terms of, the Ethiopian government is okay in terms of having good policies and strategies in places. Working with key government officials over the last 4.5 years in transforming our food system. I will highlight some critical transitions that can unlock multiple and positive outcomes. The agenda that we are trying to address today, in terms of addressing the current food and hunger crisis in Ethiopia. So we are more focusing on long-term solutions. So I will take 3 points from all the 3 points that we are identified in Ethiopia in terms of transforming our food and land use system. So 3 critical areas. Number 1 is shifting to more sustainable and regenerative agricultural commercialization is critically important, which is even can transform our food system. So Ethiopia is moving from subsistence farming to agriculture commercialization as we are moving. It's critically important to adopt sustainable and regenerative agricultural commercialization to our the system. So the Ministry of Agriculture, Ethiopian Agricultural Transformation Institute, and in collaboration with Food and Land Use Coalition, multi-stakeholders, we already identified potential farming practices and technologies that can offer a greater promises for investment in the scale up in Ethiopia. We aim to do this initiative in 30 waradas, 30 agricultural commercialization cluster. So if the buy-in of this approach by millions of our smallholder farmers could continue, increase our productivity, and will enhance our food security and resilience of our farmers to climate change, which is going to be hitting 10% of our GDP by 2045. That means even we can even contribute to preventing these recurrent droughts happening in the country. Like we are hit by 12 times over the last maybe 15 years. So this is one of critical area where we can adequately invest and can harvest good investment in terms of transforming our food system. 2 is if adequate finance is available. The critical area where we believe and think important is reducing post-harvest losses. Again, the Ministry of Agriculture and many stakeholders are ready to take this because in Ethiopia, the food implication of the post-harvest loss can even feed 23 million people per year. The crops that if we are able to save the post-harvest loss. If we change this to monetary, 1.2 billion saving USD dollar per year, which is again 10% of our GDP. So if we are able to invest in post-harvest loss management and technologies, it's possible for us even to feed. Like we are facing these big challenges while we are having 8 million chronically food insecure, as well as this year even increased to 22 million food insecure people. So we can even close this gap by just investing in post-harvest loss management. So the Ministry of Agriculture is ready in adopting post-harvest, standard food loss and waste protocol, from measuring and reporting to taking care of the management as well. So it's ready. If investment comes, it is possible for us to make a transition, and which can contribute to even the current food crisis in the country. I will just go to the third one, which is important again. Another area where we can inject adequate finance and help uplift farmers and communities, can even increase our GDP, is helping our smallholder farmers to rejuvenate to rejuvenate their coffee. So Ethiopia farmers are producing the most iconic coffee to the globe, but they are doing this by with lots of challenges. One of it is our coffee, like 80% of our coffee is old. So if we are able to inject money to that one, it is possible to uplift farmers who are already engaged in this business, which is a quarter of our population is in this livelihood is depending on coffee production. So I already see polls on the screen. I think I'm over time, so happy to clarify more. We have more action areas where we can transform our food system. Happy to share as we go. Thank you so much.
Sorry, I was on mute. Thank you, Sophia. You've made some really great points, and thank you for these practical insights on how we can move forward. So thank you so much for dialing in. We may have a bit of time for questions. I'm going to see. We're going to go now to Sarah. And Sarah, I realize it's a very busy time with the spring meetings coming up so soon. So thank you for making the time to speak here. The World Bank, as we know, has a crucial role to play in helping countries respond to the global food crisis. Last year, 30 billion was made available to countries to deal with the rise in food insecurity. What can you tell us about how countries use that financing, and what is needed to help countries break the cycle of food crises? Please also feel free to reflect on anything else you've heard as it relates to the evolution roadmap or MDB reform. Over to you, Sarah.
Great. Many thanks for your question, Paul. Indeed, the World Bank does have a crucial role to play, and more importantly, it is playing an unusually big role in helping countries respond to the global food crisis. It's almost a year since the World Bank publicly committed to making available $30 billion to countries to deal with the rise in food insecurity, which is part of a more comprehensive global response to the food crisis. More unusually, rather than simply responding by scaling up the short-term needs, every effort has been made in committing this financing to ensuring that the short-term response is not being achieved at the expense of the longer-term response needed to deliver a food systems transformation. And we need to do this in order to break the ever-decreasing cycle of food security crises. We need to boost food and nutrition security globally. We need to reduce the risks, build resilience, and strengthen our food systems. Now, of the $30 billion that's already been committed, 12 billion of the 30 billion has been in new lending commitments, and 18 billion has been through reallocations from other sectors to food and nutrition security. Almost half of the finance that has been earmarked is for Africa, which, as I think we all know, has been hardest hit by the current food and nutrition security crisis. And the funding includes active interventions in 22 of the world's 24 hunger hotspot countries, as identified by the World Food Programme and FAO using IPC data. Now, examples of new World Bank projects on food and nutrition security in the right place at the right time I'll just run through a few of the examples, but of course there are many given the size of the commitment. We have a new $125 million project in Jordan, which aims to strengthen the development of the agriculture sector by enhancing climate resilience, increasing competitiveness and inclusion, and ensuring medium to long-term food security. We have a $300 million project in Bolivia that will contribute to increasing food security. A $315 million loan to support food security in Chad, Ghana, and Sierra Leone. A $500 million project on the Emergency Food Security and Resilience Support Project in Egypt, and a whopping $2.3 billion food system resilience program for Eastern Southern Africa to help countries increase their resilience throughout the region and their ability to tackle the growing food insecurity. Now, due to the magnitude of the current food and nutrition security crisis, we are of the view that no one organization alone can deliver the needed response to the crisis, and that coordination and collaboration are key. I know some of the people online today were with us on our journey, which started almost a year ago exactly, when the World Bank and the then German G7 presidency announced the launch of the Global Alliance for Food Security, which was designed to catalyze an immediate, a coordinated and agile response to the unfolding food security crisis. And the Alliance has developed a publicly accessible global dashboard on food and nutrition security, which provides timely information for decision makers in countries around the world by providing a common base of data and information to work with. But more importantly, what we're trying to do is actually shine a light on tracking the financial response in each of these countries so that we can identify where the gaps are, and more importantly, focus the financial investments to the countries that are in most need. An integral part of the Global Alliance has been rolling out of food security crisis preparedness plans. Again, this is not something that's being done in isolation. We're doing it with our UN partners. We're doing it with the World Food Programme, FAO, UNHCR, UNOCHA, to ensure that at the country level, we also have a coordinated and concerted response to put in place strategies and tools which help us better prevent and mitigate the risk of future food security crises. Now, in terms of the MDB reform, I'll just say one word. I'm very conscious of the fact that I'm out of time here. Our shareholders, our clients, our partners want the multilateral development banks, including the World Bank Group, to be able to do more for global public goods, particularly on climate adaptation and mitigation. And we view the requests, in fact, as a vote of confidence in the work that we have been doing in the climate arena. We have actually already secured loans in excess of $32 billion in the last financial year. Now, the consultation for what is being dubbed the Evolution Roadmap will kick off during our forthcoming spring meetings. And there's a lot of work ahead of us, but I think we are optimistic that at the end of this process, the World Bank will be a much stronger organization and in a much better position to address the current challenges, such as the global food and nutrition security challenge that we're facing today. So with those few words, Paul, I'm going to hand back to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sarah. It's really great to have the World Bank voice in this conversation, and thanks for giving us a rundown of some of the numbers and the examples of the work being done. So important to be able to hear directly from you and your colleagues about how things are moving forward. We were hoping to have a few minutes to take a few questions for the audience from the audience, but I think our timing's a little too tight to do that justice now. What I'd love you to do is, if you do want to comment in the chat as we go to our next speaker, we can also keep the discussions going. So if we hear your questions, we will try and come back to you with some answers to them from one of our speakers. Also, obviously, after this, we will find ways to continue that conversation. So I'm going to now, before we close, we have one more speaker. So there's lots of opportunities to engage in advocacy around the global food crisis and in the Hungry for Action campaign. So it's my pleasure to introduce the new campaign director, Alice McDonald. who's going to speak a little bit to this and some of those opportunities. So over to you, Alice.
Thanks very much, Paul, and thank you to everyone for a fascinating conversation. I think I started in this role, it's my 9th day, I think, of no, 7th maybe. So I've worked in this space before for a long time, and I suppose that's part of the reason that Hungry for Action campaign came into being, that I'm sure all of you on this call feel like we've talked about the problems within the strategy to tackle hunger, to fix food systems. And as Sarah mentioned, you know, there was a huge amount of energy around the G7 last year, as David mentions, and speakers from across the world. We see this playing out every day on the ground. And I think what I took away from that conversation was we have the evidence of the problem. There is a huge amount of policy work, whether it was, you know, Francine's report on the costs of ending hunger in specific countries, and the work that David's been doing on the financing needed. So we've got all of that policy work. What we need to keep building up, I think, is the public pressure and the campaigning around this. And I'm sure there's lots of people in this room who are campaigners, lots of people who focus on policy, advocacy, and the idea of the Hungry for Action campaign is to bring us all together to really keep the pressure up on tackling hunger, which is, you know, one of the biggest scandals of our time. So as Paul said at the beginning, we want to make sure that tackling the global food crisis is at the top of decision makers' agenda and unlock the different kinds of policy interventions and actions needed. And it has 2 fundamental core tenets. One, saving lives now. And Martin spoke to, you know, the emergency needs that we see in the work that agencies like WFP are doing. And the second area that we don't want to keep repeating this cycle, we want to build resilience now and secure the future. So the Hungry for Action campaign is a burgeoning campaign. Everyone is welcome to join. There are some key moments for the campaign that have already been set out, and we are looking at working on more of those this year alone. We have, you know, G7, G20 as always, and the World Bank and IMF spring and autumn meetings, as well as planning around a summit in France in June. And just because the spring meetings are coming up, I'm just going to focus on a few things around that. So as I said, I think, and Sarah spoke to this, there is a lot of great work going on at the bank to tackle the issues of food security and the emergency issues. But our asks still kind of focus around those top line asks. How do we get the action needed to save lives now and build resilience for the future? And David and others are engaged in a broader campaign around some asks around reform of the multilateral development banks, and we're supporting those. So what we'll be doing next week is sharing some core messages, key campaign messages with campaign partners. We'd be grateful if you can build those into your advocacy, just so we're speaking on some of the same hymn sheets. We will be carrying out some social media activations, and again, we will share a link with assets to that. We hope those will be useful. And we will potentially be doing some activities on the ground, but we'll be just working those through. It all comes up very quickly. And I think the bigger ask is please join the campaign and get involved. As Sarah mentioned, there'll be advocacy opportunities as well. And I think inputting into the evolution roadmap will also be a key area for this community. So we will help share information on that. So I think, just to summarize for me, the top line messages, we'll be sharing some of these. Firstly, this is an emergency right now. Secondly, this is an injustice. David spoke to some of that, but it cannot be right. But the poorest people are spending 50% of their incomes on food. This is solvable. We have the answers. And this is in all our interests to do it, whether it is for the economy, geopolitical interests, or the resilience that will help save millions of lives in the future. So I think I will finish there. We will be sharing a package next week. Rosie will put in the chat a few links. If you're not on our mailing list and would like to be, please email Rosie, and do follow us on Twitter and social media platforms under Hungry for Action. So thank you very much. And I'm looking forward to working with you in the weeks and years ahead.
Thank you so much for setting the call to action, Alice, and for being in position to really help bring us together and lead this. And so I do encourage you to reach out to Alice if you do want to ask questions around the campaign, or also find out how you can get involved, and check out those links in the chat. It's a busy time leading into the spring meetings, and we really need to all join forces to make a big impact. So it's been great to see the turnout for this discussion. I thank my speakers for staying to time. I know it's challenging, but it was great to be able to get all these perspectives from around the world and from different perspectives around this big challenge. So I want to extend a huge thank you to all of our speakers today. Thank you for your comments, for taking the time to speak today. Thanks to the Hungry for Action team working to get this webinar up and running, and to all those involved in the campaign. So we need all hands on deck. If you haven't done so, join Hungry for Action campaign and take part. We'll share this recording and all relevant links following the session, but thank you for joining and have a great rest of your day. Thanks so much.